Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome back to this cozy corner of history where we explore the stories that time tried to bury. Tonight, we're following Robert, a successful wool merchant in 1287 London who lost everything when a single storm sank his cargo ship. But losing his money was just the beginning. Medieval law would imprison him indefinitely until every debt was paid, separating him from his family for over 4 years in the notorious Fleet prison, where men died waiting for freedom that might never come. This is the story of what happened when you couldn't pay your debts in a world without bankruptcy protection, without mercy, and without hope of a second chance. Whether you're nestled under warm blankets ready to drift off to sleep, or simply seeking to unwind with some gentle historical storytelling, I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this evening with me. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a comfort to see our community of history enthusiasts gathered here from every corner of the globe. And if you find peace in these calm, immersive tales from ages past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey together. But for now, let's allow the gentle weight of modern comfort to settle around you as we travel back to a time and place where the simple act of falling behind on a payment could mean losing everything you held dear. Tonight, we're walking the cobblestone streets of 13th century London, following a story that will remind us just how precious our modern financial protections truly are. Picture yourself settling deeper into your pillow as we begin this tale of Robert de Ashby, a wool merchant whose comfortable life would crumble like autumn leaves beneath the weight of medieval debt. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow as we explore together what it meant to owe money in a world where bankruptcy laws didn't exist, where debtors' prisons waited with open gates, and where entire families could be destroyed by a single failed harvest or missed payment. Take a deep breath with me now, feeling the softness of your bedding, the warmth of your room, the safety of your walls. Hold on to that comfort as we journey back 700 years to a world where such simple pleasures were luxuries beyond imagination for those unfortunate enough to find themselves trapped in the merciless machinery of medieval debt collection. Let us begin with Robert on a morning when his world still felt secure, when the future stretched before him like a well-traveled road, and when the very concept of losing everything seemed as distant as the stars above your comfortable bed tonight. The year was 1287, and Robert de Ashby woke in his timber-framed house on Cheapside to the sound of his wife Margaret humming as she prepared their morning meal. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted through their home, a luxury that marked their family's comfortable position in London's merchant class. Robert stretched in his feather bed, itself a symbol of prosperity that most of his neighbors could only dream of, and listened to the gentle sounds of his household stirring to life. His daughter Elena, barely 16, was already at her spinning wheel, her voice joining her mother's in a melody that spoke of contentment and security. Feel the peace of your own morning routine as you imagine Robert's contentment in those final moments of his old life. The sun streaming through the expensive glass windows of his shop below, the familiar weight of his leather purse heavy with silver coins, the respectful nods of fellow merchants as he walked through the marketplace. Robert had worked 20 years to build his wool trading business, importing the finest fleeces from Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, selling them to cloth makers across London, and even exporting to the growing markets in Flanders. His reputation was solid, his credit good, and his future seemed as certain as the stone walls of London Bridge. But comfort, as you know well in your warm bed tonight, can be more fragile than we imagine. Robert's prosperity rested on a foundation of credit and trust that medieval commerce had built over generations, a system that could turn from friend to executioner with the speed of a merchant's failing fortune. The wool trade, like all medieval commerce, operated on promises and future payments. Robert would advance money to shepherds for their next season's fleece, buy wool on credit from established suppliers, and sell finished goods to drapers who might not pay for months. This web of debt and credit kept the wheels of commerce turning, but it also meant that one broken link could bring down everything. As autumn arrived that year, Robert received word that would begin his descent into a nightmare that medieval debtors knew all too well. A ship carrying 300 pounds worth of his finest wool, nearly 5 years' income for a skilled craftsman, had foundered in a storm off the coast of Calais. The cargo was lost, but the debt remained. Robert had borrowed heavily to finance that shipment, using his house and shop as collateral with a consortium of London moneylenders. The loss of the wool meant he couldn't repay the loans, and medieval law provided no mercy for such misfortune. Feel the security of your savings account, dear listener, the protection of insurance policies and modern financial systems that didn't exist in Robert's world. Where you might file a claim or restructure a debt, Robert faced the medieval reality that debt was a moral failing, a break in the sacred bond of trust that held society together. There was no concept of limited liability, no bankruptcy court to provide a fresh start, no social safety net to catch falling merchants. There was only the inexorable machinery of medieval justice grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. The first sign of trouble came when Robert's usual suppliers began demanding immediate payment for goods he had always bought on credit. Word traveled quickly through the tight-knit merchant community of medieval London, and everyone knew that a man who couldn't pay his debts was a man whose word had become worthless. Robert found himself visiting moneylenders in the shadows of St. Paul's Cathedral, men who charged interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush, 20%, 30%, sometimes 50% annually, rates that the church officially condemned, but that desperate merchants accepted as the price of survival. Breathe deeply and feel grateful for the regulated financial institutions that protect you tonight. Robert had no consumer protection laws, no truth in lending acts, no government oversight of predatory lending practices. The medieval money market was a brutal place where the strong preyed upon the weak, where compound interest could multiply a debt beyond any possibility of repayment, and where the law favored the creditor absolutely. Robert borrowed money to pay money to borrow money, each transaction making his situation more desperate, each day bringing him closer to the point where medieval society would cast him out entirely. Margaret tried to maintain their household's appearance of normalcy, but she could see the strain in her husband's face as he left each morning for increasingly desperate meetings with potential lenders. She began selling their household goods quietly. First the silver plates that had been her mother's wedding gift, then the fine tapestries that had decorated their hall, finally even her own jewelry, passed down through generations of merchant wives. Elena stopped her spinning, for there was no money to buy wool, and she watched her parents' whispered conversations with the understanding that their world was collapsing around them. The medieval system of debt collection was personal and immediate in ways that would shock modern debtors. When Robert failed to meet a payment deadline, his creditors didn't send polite letters or make phone calls. Instead, they appeared at his door with the sheriff's men, demanding immediate satisfaction of the debt. Under the ancient laws of distress, they could seize any of Robert's property they could find: his furniture, his clothing, his tools, even his food. They could literally take the bread from his family's mouths and the clothes from their backs, leaving them with nothing but what they wore. Rest in the knowledge that your possessions are protected by due process, that your wages cannot be garnished without court approval, that your home cannot be taken without extensive legal proceedings. Robert lived in a world where a creditor's sworn statement was enough to authorize the seizure of everything a debtor owned. The medieval legal system assumed that debt was a clear-cut matter of right and wrong, with no consideration for circumstances, no recognition of economic hardship, no possibility of negotiation or compromise. As winter approached, Robert's situation became desperate. His shop stood empty, his goods seized by creditors, his reputation in ruins. But medieval law had one final punishment for debtors who couldn't pay: imprisonment. The concept of debtors' prison might seem archaic to modern ears, but it was a harsh reality for thousands of medieval merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who found themselves unable to satisfy their obligations. The logic was simple and brutal. If a man wouldn't pay his debts, he would be imprisoned until he found a way to pay them. Feel the warmth of your bed and the security of your home as we follow Robert to the Fleet Prison, London's most notorious debtors' jail. Unlike criminal prisons, which were meant to hold people temporarily before trial or punishment, debtors' prisons were designed to hold men indefinitely until they could find some way to satisfy their creditors. The theory was that imprisonment would motivate debtors to find hidden assets, to call upon family members for help, or to work out some arrangement with their creditors. The reality was that imprisonment usually made it impossible for debtors to earn any money at all, trapping them in a cycle of poverty that could last for years or even decades. Robert arrived at the Fleet Prison on a grey December morning, his hands bound with rough hemp rope, his family following behind with tears streaming down their faces. The prison stood like a monument to medieval justice. Tall stone walls topped with iron spikes, narrow windows barred with thick metal grates, and guards who looked at incoming debtors with the casual indifference of men who had seen thousands of similar tragedies. Margaret pressed a small leather pouch into Robert's hands, the last of their silver coins saved from the creditor's seizure, and whispered promises that she would find some way to secure his release. The Fleet Prison's interior was a nightmare that would haunt Robert for the rest of his life. The smell hit him first: unwashed bodies, spoiled food, human waste, and the damp rot of stone walls that never saw sunlight. The debtors section was overcrowded beyond belief, with men sleeping on straw pallets laid directly on the stone floor, huddling together for warmth in the winter cold. Some had been there for months, others for years, all united by their inability to pay debts that grew larger with each passing day. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the contrast between Robert's stone cell and your comfortable mattress. Where you have heat and light at the touch of a switch, Robert had only what little warmth could be generated by dozens of men pressed together in a space designed for half their number. Where you have clean water and regular meals, Robert faced the medieval reality that even prisoners had to pay for their own food and lodging. The Fleet Prison operated on a fee system that would trap many debtors in a vicious cycle. They owed money for their crimes, but they also owed money for their imprisonment, and the combination often made escape impossible. Robert's first cellmate was a man named Thomas, a baker who had borrowed money to expand his shop just before a series of poor harvests made grain too expensive for ordinary people to buy bread. Thomas had been in the Fleet for 3 years, and he explained the prison's brutal economics to Robert in a voice made hoarse by the damp air and poor food. Prisoners who could afford to pay the keeper received better accommodations, more food, and even permission to leave the prison during the day to work at their trades. Those who couldn't pay, and their numbers grew every day, were confined to the common areas, fed thin gruel once a day, and left to survive as best they could. Feel grateful for the presumption of innocence that protects you tonight, for the legal principle that punishment should fit the crime, for the constitutional prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment that didn't exist in Robert's world. Medieval debtors weren't considered criminals in the modern sense, but they were treated worse than many actual criminals. They had committed no violent acts, stolen nothing, hurt no one directly, but they were imprisoned indefinitely for the simple inability to pay money they didn't have. The daily routine in the Fleet Prison was designed to break men's spirits and force them to find some way to satisfy their creditors. Robert woke each morning to the sound of the keeper's bell, calling for the collection of fees that most prisoners couldn't pay. Those who could afford to pay received a bowl of thin porridge and a piece of bread that was often moldy. Those who couldn't pay received nothing at all. forced to depend on the charity of their fellow prisoners or the occasional gift from family members who might visit on Sundays. Robert spent his first weeks in a state of shock that gradually gave way to the grinding despair that characterized long-term imprisonment. He wrote letters to former business associates, begging for loans or partnerships that might secure his release. He sent messages to distant relatives, asking for help that rarely came. He even considered the degrading option of publicly confessing his inability to pay, hoping that some creditor might take pity on him and accept a partial payment. But medieval creditors were not known for their mercy, and Robert's pleas fell on deaf ears. The psychological toll of debtors' prison was perhaps even worse than the physical hardships. Robert had been a respected member of his community, a man whose word was trusted in business dealings across London. Now he was reduced to begging for scraps of food, sleeping on filthy straw, and watching his body slowly waste away from malnutrition and disease. The shame was overwhelming, but even worse was the knowledge that his family was suffering in his absence. Margaret had been forced to move in with her brother's family, working as a servant in exchange for room and board. Elena had taken employment as a seamstress, earning barely enough to keep herself fed, while saving every penny toward her father's release. Breathe deeply and feel the support systems that surround you tonight. Family who love you, friends who care about your well-being, institutions that provide help in times of crisis. Robert's world offered none of these protections. Medieval society was built on the assumption that families and communities would take care of their own, but when economic disaster struck, that support system often collapsed under the weight of its own members' needs. Robert's friends couldn't help him because they were struggling to avoid the same fate. His family couldn't help him because they had nothing left to give. As months passed, Robert began to understand the true horror of the medieval debt system. He met men who had been imprisoned for debts as small as a few shillings, amounts that a modern person might pay without thinking twice. He met fathers who had been separated from their children for years, husbands who had watched their wives remarry believing them dead, craftsmen whose skills had atrophied during long imprisonments until they were unemployable even if they gained their freedom. The debtor's prison wasn't just a place of punishment, it was a machine for destroying lives, families, and communities. One of Robert's fellow prisoners was a man named William, a carpenter who had borrowed money to buy tools for his trade. William had been in the fleet for 5 years, and his debt had grown from £10 to over £40 through the accumulation of interest and prison fees. His wife had died of fever while he was imprisoned, unable to afford a physician's care. His children had been taken in by the parish, scattered to different households as servants and apprentices. William had lost everything, but he still owed money, and the law said he couldn't be released until every penny was paid. Feel the warmth of your family's love as you imagine William's isolation, cut off from everyone he cared about by the inexorable machinery of medieval justice. Where modern bankruptcy laws recognize that sometimes people need a fresh start, medieval law assumed that debt was a permanent moral stain that could only be removed by complete payment. There was no concept of discharge, no recognition that circumstances beyond a person's control might make payment impossible, no acknowledgement that the costs of imprisonment might exceed any possible benefit to creditors. Robert's health began to deteriorate as his first winter in the Fleet prison dragged on. The combination of poor food, bad air, and constant stress took its toll on his body. He developed a persistent cough that echoed through the stone corridors, a reminder of the damp cold that never left the prison walls. His clothes, once the fine woolens of a prosperous merchant, became thin and ragged. His hands, once soft from a life of indoor work, became calloused and dirty from the menial tasks that prisoners performed to earn a few pennies toward their keep. The social dynamics of the debtors' prison were complex and often cruel. Men who had once been equals in the outside world found themselves divided by their ability to pay prison fees. Those who received money from family members or friends formed an informal aristocracy, able to buy better food, warmer clothing, and even small luxuries like candles or writing materials. Those who had nothing, and their numbers grew constantly, existed at the bottom of the prison hierarchy, dependent on charity and increasingly desperate as their debts continued to accumulate. Robert tried to maintain his dignity and his hope, but both eroded slowly under the grinding pressure of prison life. He watched men arrive, filled with confidence that they would quickly arrange their release, only to see that confidence crumble as weeks turned to months and months turned to years. He saw strong men reduced to begging, proud craftsmen forced to perform the most degrading tasks for a few scraps of food, fathers who wept silently in the night as they thought of children they might never see again. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the contrast between Robert's desperation and your own peaceful rest. Where you can plan for the future with reasonable confidence, Robert faced each day with the knowledge that he might never leave the Fleet prison alive. Where you have legal protections and social support systems, Robert had only the capricious mercy of creditors who viewed him as a lesson to other potential debtors. The medieval system was designed to be harsh, to make examples of those who couldn't pay, to maintain the sacred trust that held the credit system together. Margaret's visits became the only bright spots in Robert's increasingly dark existence. She would arrive on Sunday afternoons, bringing what little food she could afford and news from the outside world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. She told him about Elena's growing skill as a seamstress, about the changing seasons that Robert could barely detect from his stone cell, about the births and deaths and marriages that continued in the community that had once been his home. But she also brought news of their mounting debts, of creditors who showed no mercy, of a world that had moved on without them. The most heartbreaking aspect of Margaret's visits was watching her try to maintain hope in the face of impossible circumstances. She would speak of new plans to raise money, of distant relatives who might help, of business opportunities that might provide a way forward. Robert could see the strain in her face, the way her clothes had become shabby and patched, the signs of malnutrition that spoke of a woman who was giving up her own meals to save money for her husband's release. But he also saw the love in her eyes, the determination that refused to abandon him, even when all logic suggested that hope was futile. As Robert's second year in the Fleet prison began, he started to understand that many men never left alive. The combination of poor conditions, inadequate food, and the constant stress of imprisonment killed debtors at a rate that would shock modern observers. Robert watched men succumb to fevers, lung diseases, and the simple inability to continue fighting. The prison kept careful records of deaths, but only because families had to pay for the removal of bodies. Even in death, the medieval debt system found ways to extract payment from those who had nothing left to give. Feel the security of your health insurance, dear listener, the protection of medical care that was unavailable to Robert and his fellow prisoners. Medieval medicine was primitive at best, and prison conditions made recovery from even minor illnesses unlikely. Robert saw men die from infections that modern antibiotics could cure in days, watched others waste away from diseases that proper nutrition might have prevented. The Fleet prison had no infirmary, no medical staff, no recognition that preserving prisoners' health might serve everyone's interests. The psychological effects of long-term imprisonment were perhaps even more devastating than the physical ones. Robert began to experience what modern psychologists would recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. He had nightmares about his former life, dreams where he was free and successful that made waking up in the stone cell even more unbearable. He found himself unable to concentrate on the letters he tried to write, unable to follow conversations with his fellow prisoners, unable to imagine a future that didn't involve the cold stone walls that had become his entire world. Some prisoners dealt with the psychological pressure by retreating into madness. Robert watched men who had been rational and articulate slowly lose their grip on reality, talking to invisible companions or engaging in repetitive behaviors that served no purpose except to fill the empty hours. Others turned to violence, fighting with their fellow prisoners over scraps of food or imagined slights. The prison keepers dealt with these disruptions harshly, adding solitary confinement to the already unbearable conditions of general imprisonment. Robert found himself thinking constantly about the concept of justice, about the society that had created the system that was destroying him. He had always accepted the medieval social order, the idea that debt was a moral obligation, and that those who couldn't pay deserved punishment. But sitting in the Fleet prison, watching good men destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, he began to question the fundamental assumptions of his world. Was it just for a man to lose his freedom because of a storm at sea? Was it fair for families to be destroyed because of economic forces they couldn't understand or control? Let your mind rest in the knowledge that these questions led to the gradual reform of debt laws, that Robert's suffering and the suffering of thousands like him eventually contributed to the development of more humane financial systems. The concept of bankruptcy, the protection of basic necessities from creditors, the recognition that sometimes people need a fresh start. All of these protections grew from the recognition that the medieval system was too harsh, too inflexible, too destructive of human dignity and social stability. But Robert couldn't see the future, couldn't know that his suffering was part of a larger story of human progress toward justice and mercy. He could only endure each day, clinging to the hope that somehow, some way, he might find his way back to freedom and to the family that still loved him despite everything that had happened. That hope was sometimes all that kept him alive through the long winter nights when the cold seemed to penetrate into his very bones and the darkness felt like it would never end. The third year of Robert's imprisonment brought changes that would reshape his understanding of human nature and social justice. A new group of prisoners arrived, men who had been caught up in the economic disruptions caused by Edward I's wars in Scotland. These weren't traditional debtors who had borrowed money for personal gain, but merchants and craftsmen who had been forced into debt by royal taxation and military requisitions. Their presence in the Fleet prison raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of debt and responsibility that even the prison keepers couldn't ignore. Among these new arrivals was a man named Geoffrey, a wool merchant like Robert but from the Yorkshire countryside. Geoffrey had been prosperous until the king's armies had requisitioned his entire year's production of wool, paying with promises of future compensation that never materialized. When Geoffrey couldn't pay his suppliers and creditors, he found himself in the same situation as Robert, imprisoned for debts that he had never chosen to incur. The two men formed a friendship based on their shared understanding of the wool trade and their common experience of economic injustice. Geoffrey brought news from the outside world that made Robert realize how widespread the problem of debt imprisonment had become. Throughout England, debtors' prisons were overflowing with men who had been caught up in the economic disruptions of Edward's reign. The king's constant need for money to fund his military campaigns had created a cycle of taxation, requisition, and forced loans that pushed many previously prosperous merchants into bankruptcy. Yet the legal system still treated each case as an individual moral failure rather than recognizing the systemic causes of widespread debt. Feel the protection of economic policies designed to prevent such widespread devastation, dear listener. Modern governments recognize that economic stability requires regulation of credit markets, protection of consumers, and social safety nets for those who fall on hard times. Robert's world had none of these protections, and the result was a system that could destroy entire communities when economic conditions changed. The medieval approach of treating debt as a personal moral issue rather than a social and economic problem created untold suffering for individuals and families, while failing to address the underlying causes of financial instability. Robert's relationship with Geoffrey provided him with intellectual companionship that helped him maintain his sanity during the darkest periods of his imprisonment. The two men would spend hours discussing the nature of justice, the proper relationship between creditors and debtors, and the social costs of the current system. Geoffrey had been educated at Oxford before entering the wool trade, and he brought a philosophical perspective to their discussions that helped Robert think beyond his immediate circumstances. Through their conversations, Robert began to understand that his personal tragedy was part of a larger pattern of social and economic change that was transforming medieval England. The growth of commerce, the development of credit systems, and the increasing monetization of the economy had created new forms of wealth and opportunity, but they had also created new forms of vulnerability and injustice. The legal system, designed for a simpler agricultural society, was struggling to adapt to the complexities of commercial life. These intellectual discussions provided Robert with a sense of purpose that helped him endure the physical hardships of prison life. He began to see himself not just as a victim of circumstances, but as a witness to a historical moment when society was being forced to confront the contradictions in its own systems of justice and economic organization. This perspective didn't make his suffering any less real, but it gave him a framework for understanding that suffering that went beyond personal shame and despair. As Robert's 4th year in the Fleet prison began, he received news that would change the trajectory of his story. Margaret had managed to secure employment as a housekeeper for a wealthy merchant family, and Elena had married a young craftsman who was willing to help with Robert's debts. Together, they had managed to save enough money to begin negotiations with Robert's creditors for a partial settlement of his obligations. The process would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, Robert could see a possible path to freedom. The negotiations were complicated by the fact that Robert's debts had continued to accumulate during his imprisonment. The original amount he owed had been substantial but manageable, but 4 years of interest charges and prison fees had multiplied his obligations to an almost impossible level. Some creditors were willing to accept partial payment, recognizing that they were unlikely to recover their full investment from a man who had been imprisoned for so long. Others held out for full payment, preferring to keep Robert in prison as an example to other potential debtors. Margaret's efforts to secure Robert's release revealed the arbitrary nature of the medieval debt system. Some creditors were merchants themselves, who understood the risks of commercial life and were willing to accept losses as part of doing business. Others were moneylenders who viewed debt as a moral obligation that couldn't be compromised regardless of circumstances. The law made no distinction between these different types of creditors, treating all debts as equally sacred regardless of the circumstances that had created them. Breathe deeply and feel grateful for the legal frameworks that today provide structure and fairness to debt collection, that prevent the arbitrary exercise of power that characterized Robert's experience. Modern bankruptcy laws recognize that different types of debts should be treated differently, that secured and unsecured creditors have different rights, and that debtors deserve protection from harassment and abuse. Robert's world had none of these protections, leaving debtors at the mercy of individual creditors whose demands could be as reasonable or as unreasonable as their personalities dictated. The process of negotiating Robert's release took nearly a year, during which time he remained in the Fleet prison, wondering whether each day might be his last behind bars. The uncertainty was almost as difficult to bear as the imprisonment itself, as hope alternately rose and fell with each report from Margaret about the progress of the negotiations. Robert had learned not to count on anything, but he couldn't help dreaming about the life he might rebuild if he ever regained his freedom. Finally, in the spring of 1292, After more than 4 years in the Fleet prison, Robert received word that his creditors had agreed to accept a settlement of roughly half of what he owed. The payment would exhaust his family's savings and leave them with nothing, but it would secure his release and allow him to begin rebuilding his life. Margaret and Elena arrived at the prison gates with tears of joy and relief, carrying the official documents that would open the doors that had held Robert captive for so long. Robert's release from the Fleet prison was a moment of profound emotional complexity. The joy of freedom was mixed with the recognition of how much he had lost, how much his family had sacrificed, and how different his life would be from the comfortable existence he had known before his imprisonment. His health had been permanently damaged by his years in prison, his reputation in the merchant community was destroyed, and his family's financial resources were completely exhausted. Freedom was a gift beyond price, but it was also the beginning of a new and difficult chapter in his life. The world that Robert returned to in 1292 was subtly different from the one he had left in 1287. The economic disruptions caused by Edward I's wars had created new opportunities for some merchants while destroying others. The credit systems that had once seemed stable and predictable had proven to be fragile and dangerous. Public opinion was beginning to turn against the harshest aspects of debt imprisonment as more and more families experienced the devastating effects of the system firsthand. Robert found that his experience in the Fleet prison had given him a perspective on justice and mercy that few of his contemporaries shared. He had seen good men destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, had witnessed the arbitrary nature of a system that claimed to be based on moral principles, but often operated according to power and privilege. This experience would influence his thinking for the rest of his life, making him more sympathetic to those who struggled with debt and more critical of systems that punished poverty while protecting wealth. The process of rebuilding his life was slow and difficult. Robert's health had been permanently damaged by his years in prison, and he tired easily from work that had once been routine. His reputation in the merchant community had been destroyed, and many of his former associates refused to do business with him. The stigma of debt imprisonment followed him everywhere, marking him as a man who had failed to meet his obligations and therefore couldn't be trusted with new ones. Margaret and Eleanor had changed during Robert's imprisonment in ways that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Margaret had developed a strength and independence that came from years of managing on her own, but she had also aged beyond her years from the stress and hardship of keeping the family together. Elena had grown from a carefree teenager into a serious young woman who understood the fragility of security and the importance of hard work. Both women had sacrificed their own dreams and ambitions to save Robert, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay that debt of love. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the complex emotions of Robert's reunion with his family, the joy mixed with sorrow, the relief tempered by the knowledge of how much had been lost. Feel grateful for the systems that today prevent such family separations, that recognize the social costs of harsh debt enforcement, that provide alternatives to imprisonment for those who cannot pay. Robert's story was repeated thousands of times throughout medieval England, creating a human cost that society was only beginning to recognize and address. Robert's experience in the Fleet prison had taught him that the line between prosperity and poverty was thinner than most people realized. He had seen merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who had lived comfortable lives reduced to begging for scraps of food, their dignity stripped away by a system that viewed debt as a moral failing rather than an economic problem. This understanding made him more generous toward those who struggled financially, more willing to extend credit on reasonable terms, and more critical of the harsh attitudes that characterized medieval debt collection. The family's financial situation remained precarious for years after Robert's release. The settlement that had secured his freedom had exhausted their savings, and Robert's damaged health and reputation made it difficult for him to earn money at his previous level. Margaret continued to work as a housekeeper. Elena contributed her earnings from seamstress work, and Robert did whatever small trading he could manage. Together, they slowly rebuilt their lives, but they never again achieved the comfortable prosperity they had known before Robert's imprisonment. Robert's story became part of the larger narrative of legal and social reform that would gradually transform medieval England's approach to debt and imprisonment. The human costs of the debtors' prison system were becoming impossible to ignore as more and more families experienced the devastating effects of long-term imprisonment for debt. Merchants and craftsmen who had once supported harsh debt enforcement began to question the wisdom of a system that could destroy the very people it claimed to protect. The gradual reform of debt laws would take centuries, but Robert's experience was part of the foundation for that reform. Each individual story of suffering and injustice contributed to the growing recognition that society needed better ways to handle financial disputes, that the costs of harsh enforcement often exceeded any benefits, and that human dignity deserved protection even in matters of commerce and credit. Robert couldn't know that his suffering was part of this larger historical process, but his experience was one thread in the tapestry of progress toward greater justice and mercy. As Robert aged, he often reflected on the lessons his imprisonment had taught him about human nature and social justice. He had seen both the worst and the best of humanity in the Fleet prison, the cruelty of a system that could destroy lives over money, but also the kindness of fellow prisoners who shared their last scraps of food with those who had nothing. He had learned that prosperity was fragile, that justice was often arbitrary, and that the most important things in life were the relationships that endured, even when everything else was lost. Robert's relationship with Margaret and Elena had been transformed by their shared ordeal. The comfortable assumptions of their earlier life had been stripped away, replaced by a deeper understanding of their mutual dependence and love. They had learned that they could survive almost anything as long as they faced it together, that external circumstances couldn't destroy the bonds that held them together, and that true security came not from wealth or status, but from the knowledge that they would never abandon each other. The legacy of Robert's imprisonment extended beyond his immediate family to influence the broader community's understanding of debt and justice. His story became one of many that gradually shifted public opinion away from the harsh certainties of medieval debt enforcement toward a more nuanced understanding of the complex factors that could lead to financial failure. This shift in attitude would eventually contribute to legal reforms that recognized the need for more humane approaches to debt collection and debtor protection. Feel the warmth of your secure bed tonight as you imagine Robert's final years, spent in modest comfort but rich in the knowledge that he had survived one of the harshest tests that medieval society could impose. His health never fully recovered from his years in prison, but his spirit had been strengthened by the experience. He had learned that a man could lose everything material and still retain his dignity, that love was stronger than any external force, and that justice was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. Robert's story reminds us that the distance between his circumstances and our comfortable beds reflects not inevitable progress, but specific choices made by countless individuals who decided that human dignity matters more than the efficient collection of debts. The legal protections that surround us tonight, the right to due process, the protection of basic necessities from creditors, the recognition that people deserve second chances, grew from the recognition that systems like the one that destroyed Robert's life were too harsh to be sustained in a just society. The medieval approach to debt imprisonment was based on the assumption that harsh punishment would deter others from failing to pay their debts, that the threat of losing everything would motivate debtors to find ways to meet their obligations. But Robert's experience, multiplied by thousands of similar stories, demonstrated that this approach often backfired, destroying productive members of society while failing to address the underlying economic problems that created widespread debt in the first place. Modern financial systems, for all their flaws, recognize principles that were foreign to Robert's world. The concept of limited liability protects entrepreneurs from personal ruin when business ventures fail. Bankruptcy laws provide a fresh start for those overwhelmed by debt. Consumer protection laws prevent the most predatory lending practices. Social safety nets catch those who fall on hard times. None of these protections existed in Robert's world, and their absence created a system that was both economically inefficient and morally devastating. The psychological trauma of debt imprisonment extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities. Robert's neighbors had watched his descent from prosperity to imprisonment with a mixture of sympathy and fear, knowing that similar circumstances could befall any of them. The arbitrary nature of medieval debt enforcement created a climate of anxiety that inhibited economic growth and social cooperation. When prosperity could be lost so quickly and completely, people became cautious about taking the risks that drove innovation and expansion. Robert's children, had they been younger when his imprisonment began, would have grown up with the shame and stigma of having a father in debtor's prison. Medieval society marked such families with an invisible but indelible stain that could affect their ability to find employment, make marriages, or achieve social advancement. Elena had been fortunate to marry before her father's imprisonment became widely known, but countless children of imprisoned debtors found their own futures constrained by circumstances beyond their control. The economic logic of debt imprisonment was fundamentally flawed, though this wouldn't be recognized for centuries. By removing productive individuals from the economy and forcing their families into poverty, the system reduced the total wealth available to satisfy creditors. Robert, free and working, might eventually have been able to pay significant portions of his debts. Robert, imprisoned and unable to work, could never pay anything beyond what his family could scrape together through their own labor. Yet medieval law insisted on the imprisonment as a matter of principle, even when it served no practical purpose. Let your mind rest in the recognition that Robert's suffering contributed to humanity's gradual understanding of these economic realities. Each story of a productive person destroyed by debt imprisonment added to the growing body of evidence that harsh enforcement was counterproductive. Merchants who watched their peers disappear into debtors' prisons began to question whether such extreme measures served anyone's interests. Gradually, the practical costs of the system became impossible to ignore. The social costs of debt imprisonment extended beyond individual families to affect the stability of entire communities. When respected merchants like Robert could lose everything overnight, it undermined confidence in the social order that supposedly rewarded hard work and virtuous behavior. If a man could do everything right, work hard, pay his taxes, support his family, contribute to his community, and still end up in prison through no fault of his own, then what meaning did conventional morality have? Robert's experience with the arbitrary nature of creditor mercy revealed another fundamental flaw in the medieval system. Some of his creditors had been reasonable people who understood that business involved risks and that sometimes those risks materialized in unfortunate ways. Others had been vindictive individuals who seemed to take personal satisfaction in his suffering. The law made no distinction between these different motivations, treating all debt as equally sacred, regardless of how it had been incurred or how it was being enforced. The religious dimensions of debt in medieval society added another layer of complexity to Robert's story. The church taught that lending money at interest was sinful, but it also taught that debt was a moral obligation that must be fulfilled regardless of circumstances. This contradiction created a theological puzzle that reflected the practical difficulties of maintaining traditional moral frameworks in an increasingly commercial society. Robert had been raised to believe that his word was his bond, that debt was a sacred trust, but his imprisonment had taught him that the system supposedly based on these principles was often cruel and unjust. Feel the comfort of living in a society that has moved beyond such rigid moral absolutes, dear listener. Modern financial systems recognize that both borrowers and lenders bear responsibility for making reasonable decisions, that circumstances can change in ways that make original agreements impossible to fulfill, and that the social costs of extreme enforcement often outweigh any moral benefits. Robert's world lacked this nuanced understanding, trapped in a system of absolute moral categories that provided no room for mercy or flexibility. The daily rhythms of Robert's life after his release were shaped by the lingering effects of his imprisonment. He woke each morning grateful for the simple freedom to leave his house, to walk the streets of London without guards, to speak with his family without restriction. But he also woke with the knowledge that his position in society had been permanently altered, that he would always be marked as a man who had failed to meet his obligations, regardless of the circumstances that had caused that failure. Margaret's experience during Robert's imprisonment had given her insights into the hidden vulnerabilities of medieval women. When her husband was taken to debtors' prison, she had suddenly found herself responsible for supporting the family with no legal rights, no business training, and no social support systems designed to help women in her situation. She had survived through intelligence, determination, and the kindness of a few individuals who recognized her desperate circumstances, but she had also learned how quickly a comfortable life could become a struggle for basic survival. Elena's coming of age during her father's imprisonment had taught her lessons about money and security that most young women of her social class never learned. She had seen how quickly prosperity could vanish, how unreliable the social structures that were supposed to protect people could be, and how important it was to develop skills that could provide income in times of crisis. These lessons would serve her well throughout her life, but they had also cost her the carefree innocence that was supposed to be part of youth. The ripple effects of Robert's imprisonment spread through his extended family and social network in ways that illustrated the interconnected nature of medieval society. His brother, also a merchant, found that some customers began to question his reliability simply because he was related to a man who had been imprisoned for debt. Robert's former apprentices had difficulty finding new positions because their association with a failed master reflected poorly on their own prospects. The medieval world was small and interconnected, and one person's fall from grace could affect many others. Robert's understanding of justice had been fundamentally altered by his experience in the Fleet prison. He had entered imprisonment believing that the legal system, however harsh, was fundamentally fair in its treatment of debtors and creditors. He had emerged with the knowledge that justice was often arbitrary, that the law could be used as a weapon by the powerful against the vulnerable, and that individual circumstances mattered less than abstract principles that served the interests of those who already had wealth and power. The gradual process of rebuilding trust within his community was one of the most difficult aspects of Robert's life after imprisonment. Some neighbors and former business associates welcomed him back with genuine warmth, recognizing that his imprisonment had been the result of circumstances rather than character flaws. Others remained suspicious, treating him as a man who might again prove unreliable in financial matters. This mixed reception was a constant reminder of how permanently his reputation had been damaged by his inability to pay debts that had grown beyond his control. Robert's relationship with money was forever changed by his experience with debt and imprisonment. Where he had once viewed credit as a normal part of business, he now approached any financial obligation with caution bordering on fear. He preferred to deal in cash whenever possible, even when credit terms might have been more advantageous. The psychological scars of debt imprisonment made it difficult for him to take the calculated risks that were essential to commercial success. The physical toll of Robert's years in the Fleet prison became more apparent as he aged. The poor food, bad air, and constant stress had weakened his constitution in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life. He tired easily, suffered from respiratory problems that dated to the damp conditions of his cell, and experienced joint pain that worsened in cold weather. These health problems were a daily reminder of the price he had paid for his inability to satisfy his creditors within the time frame demanded by medieval law. Breathe deeply and feel grateful for the medical care that protects you tonight, for the recognition that imprisonment should not include the deliberate destruction of a person's health. Robert's world made no distinction between punishment and torture, accepting that debtors' prisons would inevitably damage their inmates' physical and mental well-being. The concept that even convicted criminals deserved humane treatment was foreign to medieval thinking, let alone the idea that debtors, who had committed no crimes, deserved protection from deliberate harm. As Robert grew older, he began to see his experience as part of a larger historical pattern of progress toward greater justice and mercy. He couldn't know the specific reforms that would eventually transform debt law, but he could see that younger merchants and craftsmen were beginning to question the wisdom of the harsh enforcement that had characterized his own era. Public opinion was slowly shifting toward the recognition that debt imprisonment was counterproductive, that it destroyed more value than it protected, and that society needed better ways to handle financial disputes. Robert's story became one that was quietly shared among London's merchant community, a cautionary tale that illustrated the vulnerability that lay beneath even apparently secure prosperity. But it was also a story of survival, of the strength that could be found in family love, and of the possibility of rebuilding a life even after experiencing the worst that the medieval legal system could inflict. These different dimensions of his story resonated with different audiences, contributing to the gradual evolution of public attitudes toward debt and punishment. The medieval system of debt imprisonment reflected broader assumptions about human nature and social order that were slowly being challenged by the practical experience of commercial life. The idea that harsh punishment would deter financial irresponsibility was being contradicted by the reality that most debt imprisonment resulted from circumstances beyond individual control. The belief that debt was primarily a moral issue was being challenged by the recognition that economic factors played a larger role than personal character in determining who could and couldn't pay their obligations. Robert's later years were marked by a quiet activism that reflected his understanding of the injustices he had experienced. He spoke out against the harshest creditors in his community, supported efforts to reform debt collection practices, and provided assistance to families whose breadwinners had been imprisoned for debt. His own experience had given him both the motivation and the credibility to advocate for changes that might prevent others from suffering as he had suffered. The legacy of Robert's imprisonment extended beyond his own lifetime to influence the next generation's approach to debt and credit. Elena, shaped by her family's experience with financial disaster, raised her own children with a deep understanding of both the opportunities and the dangers of commercial life. She taught them to be generous to those in financial difficulty, to question systems that seemed unjust, and to value security and family relationships above material prosperity. Margaret's transformation during Robert's imprisonment from a merchant's comfortable wife to a working woman struggling for survival illustrated the hidden strengths that medieval women possessed, but rarely had occasion to display. Her experience managing the family's affairs, negotiating with creditors, and supporting the household through her own labor challenged conventional assumptions about women's capabilities and proper roles. Though she couldn't have known it at the time, her experience was part of a larger pattern of women's expanding participation in economic life. The community that surrounded Robert's family during their crisis revealed both the strengths and limitations of medieval social support systems. Some neighbors and relatives provided crucial assistance during the darkest periods, sharing food, offering employment, and maintaining social connections that helped the family survive. Others turned away, either unable to help or unwilling to associate with a family marked by financial failure. This mixed response illustrated the informal nature of medieval welfare systems and their dependence on personal relationships and individual generosity. Robert's gradual understanding of the systemic nature of the problems he had experienced marked an important step in his intellectual and moral development. Initially, he had blamed himself for his imprisonment, accepting the medieval assumption that debt was primarily a matter of personal responsibility. Gradually, he came to understand that his experience was part of a larger pattern of economic and legal structures that created unnecessary suffering while failing to serve their stated purposes of maintaining commercial trust and social order. The transformation of Robert's worldview from acceptance of traditional authority to critical questioning of unjust systems reflected a broader intellectual evolution that was beginning to characterize late medieval society. The practical experience of commercial life was generating new ideas about justice, individual rights, and the proper role of government in regulating economic relationships. Robert's personal journey from prosperous merchant to imprisoned debtor to critical observer of social injustice was one small part of this larger historical transformation. Feel the safety of your bed tonight as you imagine Robert's final acceptance of his place in this larger story, his recognition that his suffering had meaning beyond his own experience. He had learned that individual tragedies could contribute to collective wisdom, that the accumulation of human stories could eventually challenge even the most entrenched systems of injustice, and that progress toward greater fairness was possible, even when it seemed impossibly slow. Robert's relationship with his faith had been deeply tested by his experience with debt imprisonment. He had been raised to believe that God rewarded virtue and punished vice, that hard work and honest dealing would be blessed with prosperity and security. His imprisonment had forced him to confront the reality that good people could suffer terribly through no fault of their own, that the systems supposedly based on Christian principles could be cruel and arbitrary, and that justice in this world was often imperfect or absent entirely. This spiritual crisis had ultimately led Robert to a deeper and more nuanced understanding of both faith and justice. He came to believe that his suffering had taught him important lessons about compassion and mercy, that his experience with injustice had given him a responsibility to work against such injustice in his own community, and that the gap between divine justice and human law created an obligation for believers to work toward greater fairness in earthly institutions. The economic understanding that Robert developed through his experience with debt and imprisonment was more sophisticated than the simple moral categories that dominated medieval thinking about financial obligations. He learned to distinguish between debts incurred through foolishness or extravagance and those resulting from circumstances beyond individual control. He understood the difference between creditors who were themselves struggling to survive and those who used debt as a weapon to accumulate power over others. These distinctions, obvious to modern observers, were revolutionary in a world that treated all debt as equally sacred. Robert's advocacy for reform was necessarily quiet and indirect, given his own vulnerable position as a former debtor. He couldn't openly challenge the legal system that had imprisoned him without risking renewed persecution. Instead, he worked through personal relationships, private conversations, and small acts of kindness to change attitudes one person at a time. This grassroots approach to social reform was typical of medieval change, which rarely came through dramatic legislative action, but rather through the gradual evolution of customs and expectations. The story of Robert's imprisonment and eventual release illustrated the fundamental tension between individual justice and social order that characterized medieval law. The system was designed to maintain the trust and predictability that made commercial life possible, but it did so through methods that could destroy individual lives and families. This tension would eventually be resolved through the development of more sophisticated legal frameworks that balanced the legitimate interests of creditors with the human rights of debtors. But that resolution lay centuries in the future. As we return from 13th century London, perhaps we can carry with us something more than just another historical tale to ease us into sleep. Robert's story speaks across 700 years to remind us that the distance between his circumstances and our comfortable beds reflects not inevitable progress, but specific choices made by countless individuals who decided that human dignity matters more than the efficient collection of debts. The legal protections that surround us tonight, the right to due process before losing our homes, the protection of basic necessities from creditors, the recognition that people deserve second chances when circumstances overwhelm them, grew from the accumulated wisdom of stories like Robert's. Each person who suffered under the harsh certainties of medieval debt law contributed to the eventual understanding that justice requires both accountability and mercy, that social stability depends on fairness as well as order, and that the protection of individual dignity serves the common good. Robert's experience teaches us that prosperity is more fragile than we often realize, that the systems we create to protect property and enforce contracts can become instruments of oppression if they lose sight of their human purpose, and that the most important protections are often those that serve people at their most vulnerable moments. The medieval approach to debt imprisonment was logical within its own framework, but it was ultimately abandoned because its human costs exceeded any benefits it provided to society. The evolution from Robert's world to our own reminds us that progress in human affairs is neither automatic nor irreversible. Each generation must choose whether to maintain the protections that previous generations fought to establish, whether to extend those protections to new areas of human vulnerability, and whether to resist the temptation to sacrifice individual dignity for the sake of efficiency or abstract principles. Robert's story is a reminder that these choices matter, that they have real consequences for real people, and that the comfortable assumptions of any era can prove to be more fragile than they appear. Sleep now, dear listener, and remember that the warmth of your bed tonight represents not just personal comfort, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human struggle toward greater justice and mercy. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of history, may your dreams carry the knowledge that individual stories of suffering and resilience can contribute to collective progress toward a more humane world. If you found comfort in this journey through history's shadows, please consider subscribing to join our community of gentle souls who believe the most important stories are often the hardest ones to hear. Like and share if this tale has touched your heart, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. There's something magical about knowing our little corner of history reaches around the world to bring people together in understanding and compassion. Good night, and may your sleep be as peaceful as Robert's final rest, knowing that love endures beyond all earthly trials, and that human dignity, once recognized, can never be entirely extinguished.